So, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I'll start out with the obvious, that these are fraught times, but I think it's great that we can all get together to consider new ideas and their relevance for our lives and for the communities that shape them. So, glad to see you here. I'm Tad Schmaltz. I'm chair of the philosophy department. I'd like to welcome you to the 43rd annual Tanner Lecture on Human Values at the University of Michigan. President Ono will introduce our speaker, Sally Haslanger, in a moment, but first I'd like to say a few words about the Tanners and the Tanner Lectures. The Tanner Lecture on Human Values, which is administered by the philosophy department, was permanently endowed by Grace Adams Tanner and Obert Clark Tanner in 1978, but in fact a lecture at Michigan the previous year by the political and legal philosopher Joel Feinberg inaugurated the series. In addition to Michigan, 5 other institutions were originally designated as permanent sponsors of the lectureships: Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge, Brasenose College at the University of Oxford, Harvard University, Stanford University, and the University of Utah. Yale University and the University of California, Berkeley were added as sponsors in 1987, and Princeton University was added in 1988. Over the years, Tanner Lectures have also been delivered at other universities worldwide. The lectures themselves are published in an annual volume. The Tanners themselves had broad intellectual interests. Grace Tanner's interests inclined toward the sciences, especially biology and anthropology. Obert Tanner studied at the University of Utah in philosophy and law. After receiving his law degree, he studied and taught philosophy and religious studies at Harvard University and Stanford University, and was a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah for 27 years. He also was a successful businessman, having founded in 1927 the O.C. Tanner Company, which produces a range of jewelry that businesses use to reward individual achievement. And in fact, as I recall, at the Winter Olympic Games in Salt Lake City, the company struck the medals that were used. The Tanners were generous philanthropists. They supported the Utah Symphony Orchestra, Ballet West, and the Utah Opera Company. They also built more than 40 public fountains and established philosophy libraries at 11 major colleges and universities, including our own splendid one right over in Angell Hall. Over the years, many distinguished intellectual figures have delivered the Tanner Lectures at Michigan, including Sir Karl Popper, Toni Morrison, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and John Rawls. Here at Michigan, it is our practice to take the Tanner Lecture as the occasion for a thorough consideration of its ideas. Each year, we have a program the morning following the lecture in which scholars from various disciplines offer perspectives on the lecture and join in a panel discussion. And this year, the symposium will be held tomorrow morning. That's from 10 a.m. to 12:30 in the Rackham Amphitheater located just above on the 4th floor of this building. Our symposiasts this year are Nora Berenstain of the University of Texas, Knoxville, Robin Dembroff of Yale University, and Nancy Frazier of the New School for Social Research. Now to introduce this year's Tanner Lecturer, I am pleased to present Dr. Santa Ono, the 15th president of the University of Michigan. President Ono joined the university in October 2022 after serving as president and vice chancellor of the University of British Columbia for 6 years. Prior to his appointment at UBC, he was president of the University of Cincinnati. He has spent his career at research universities, including Emory, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and University College London. President Ono is an experienced vision researcher whose work in experimental medicine focuses on the immune system and eye disease. He holds degrees from the University of Chicago and McGill University and is also an accomplished cellist. We are pleased to welcome Professor Santa Ono to our annual Tanner Lecture.
Thank you very much, Tad. It's really wonderful to be here in what I like to call the Temple of Graduate Education. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon, especially for the students that are in attendance today. It's our distinct pleasure at the University of Michigan to welcome you to the Tanner Lecture on Human Values. And you've heard a little bit about the history of the Tanner Lecture and how it has continued to bring eminent scholars to this institution. But today is particularly joyous in welcoming back to Ann Arbor one of our own as the guest and keynote speaker. And it was once said, I don't know if you know this, Sally, that Sally Haslanger, this is a quote, combines energy, expository skill, openness, and sheer hard work to inspire undergraduates at all levels. She has a rare ability to reach diverse audiences, non-concentrators and concentrators, first-year and advanced students, humanists, and social scientists within a single course. And I don't know if you remember who said that, but those were the words of the former provost of the University of Michigan, J. Bernie Mackin, in recommending you to become an associate professor of philosophy here, and also the Arthur F. Thurneau Professorship in 1997. So we dug that up, and we thought that that would be meaningful to you. And I know that Ann Arbor and Michigan mean a lot to you. I heard that you were married here and you adopted your kids here, so really welcome back to the University of Michigan. That would be one of many awards and accolades over the years since that time, bestowed upon a scholar later described by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as a, quote, distinguished figure in metaphysics, epistemology, feminist philosophy, and critical race theory. Sally is now the Ford Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, an affiliate in the MIT Women's and Gender Studies program, where I think she was director. She has published broadly, and her work links issues of social justice with contemporary work in epistemology, philosophy of language, and philosophy of the mind. She has been selected Distinguished Women Philosopher by the Society of Women in Philosophy, who lauded her as one of the very best analytic feminists in the century. Her book, Resisting Reality, Social Construction and Social Critique, which collected 20 years of her essays, received the 2014 Joseph B. Gittler Award for Outstanding Work in Philosophy in the Social Sciences from the American Philosophical Association. In 2015, she was the Spinoza Professor at the University of Amsterdam, and her lectures have appeared as a booklet entitled Critical Theory and Practice. She's given lectures across the United States and internationally, including the Karras Lectures at the APA, the Kant Lectures at Stanford, and the Siebert Lectures at the University of Pennsylvania. Her most recent focus has included working on social practices, social structure, structural explanation with an emphasis on the materiality of social practices, and the role of ideology. She's been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to put all of this together into a book titled Doing Justice to the Social, which is now under contract with OUP. In addition to a deep scholarly commitment, Professor Haslanger has been just as steadfast in promoting diversity in the field of philosophy and beyond. She founded and convened the Women in Philosophy Task Force, a group that works to coordinate initiatives and intensify efforts to advance women in philosophy. She also co-founded a summer philosophy institute for undergraduates from underrepresented groups. She was awarded the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award at MIT in 2014 and a YWCA Cambridge Tribute to Outstanding Women in 2011. She served as president of the Eastern Division of the APA, and in 2015 was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. On her website, Professor Haslanger includes a page with some of her favorite quotes and poems. I believe one of those quotes particularly speaks to Professor Haslanger's work, but also to the important role of academia in general. It comes from writer and activist Adrienne Marie Brown. And it goes as so. Things are not getting worse, they're getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. Today, Professor Haslanger will speak to us about intersecting social systems and the reproduction of injustice. I look forward to, as I'm sure all of you do, to her lecture and thank her for her work in continuing to pull back the veil. Please join me in welcoming the 2023 tenor lecture on human values, Professor Sally Haslanger.
Appreciate it. Wonderful. Am I okay? Okay, good. I don't want to make you all lose your hearing with feedback. Thank you so much for the wonderful introductions. I'm humbled. It's slightly embarrassing to hear yourself with all of that listed, but I'm very grateful for clearly the work you put into sort of pulling that together. And it's really an honor to be here. So thank you very, very much. There is a handout. So if you haven't gotten a handout, you might want to get it from the back. There are also large print handouts for those who are visually impaired. I hope that will help, plus the screen. I want to express my support for the Graduate Student Union. Graduate students are an essential part of a research and teaching institution as great as this one, and in fact, even ones that aren't as great as this one. And I really think that they deserve full support by the faculty and administration in making their lives manageable and enabling them to thrive. We just have a brand new union at MIT, actually, and that union is in contract negotiations right now. But we've only been going, like the grad student union here was initiated when I was still here, and ours is just beginning. It's a year old, so they've got a lot of work to do to even begin to catch up. I want to mention that the topic of today, intersectionality, is has had very long-standing presence in interdisciplinary research, and by no means have I really plumbed the depth of that literature. And I want to make it clear that I'm not attempting to do that. I'm not pretending that I have answers to so many of the questions that the issue of intersectionality raises. And I'm just trying to look at it through one lens that I hope will be helpful, but it's really hard, and I need your help in thinking about it. So I'm really looking forward to our discussions. I'm looking forward to our conversations tomorrow with the panelists. There are some parts of the paper that I'm not going to go over today because it's just too long and there's too many different examples and such like that. But I'm happy to talk in more depth about that, about the details that they raise tomorrow. And I hope we have a great discussion. So let's get started. So I'm going to guide you back and forth between the handout and the slides. And the first section First, what I'm going to do is introduce the outline, and then I'm going to read from the handout the first section. So here's my outline. I'm going to do an introduction and an overview, and then I'm going to talk about oppression and the idea of group-based oppression. I'm then going to apply some of the insights from that section to think about intersectional oppression. Then I'll look at patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, and have a very brief review of the idea that these are three distinct systems. Very commonly, this was back in the day in socialist feminist work, the controversy between dual systems theory and single systems theory was very heated, and I think it has come back again by adding race to the mix. So I'll do a little tiny review of that, and then I'm going to go into the part that's probably going to be hardest to present, that it's because it's a lot of social ontology, and I know that not everybody gets excited about social ontology, and it can be a bit, you know, kind of out there, but I hope you have fun. And then I'm going to talk about cultural logics and the system dynamics. And this is going to be a way for me to think about how intersectionality works if it's not separate systems. It's in terms of the dynamics, and then I'll draw a conclusion. Okay, so here we are with the introduction and overview. So I'm going to read from the handout. So the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to capture a broad set of phenomena that occur when oppression is the result of interaction between multiple social categories. Now, this wasn't the first time that people had noticed this. There was a literature before Crenshaw that didn't use the term intersectionality, but she was the one who coined the term. Then in 1991, she distinguished three forms of intersectionality. First, structural intersectionality, which occurs paradigmatically when systems of race, gender, and class domination converge. Then political intersectionality, which occurs because the interests of women of color may not track the potentially conflicting interests of women per se, or people of color per se in general. And then representational intersectionality occurs when the cultural imagery of different social categories marginalizes or obscures those who fall within multiple vulnerable groups. So today I'm going to really focus on structural intersectionality, but I think at the end, if I have time, I'll say a little bit about how the account I'm offering of structural intersectionality allows us to see how these three things are connected. And so we'll see if we can get there. Okay, so focusing on structural intersectionality, I'm going to take up these questions. Should we analyze race, class, and gender, which is the way that Crenshaw described it, or I think better, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy as separate systems? How should we understand the convergence of systems, and how do forms of intersectional oppression emerge through such convergence? Okay, so I thought it was best, given that the paper has got lots of moving parts, to give a broad overview so you get the sense of where I'm headed, and then I'll go through the details. Okay, so I'm going to begin by arguing that group oppression comes in two forms: discrimination and social formation. And then I'll consider how intersectionality takes two forms depending on the kind of group at issue. Then in developing this social formation idea, I'll argue that the groups formed within social systems aren't, at least in the first instance, best understood as gender, race, or class per se. Instead, social systems constitute historically and culturally specific thick positions, such as poor Black single mother or undocumented Latina domestic. And these cut across gender and race and class. However, these concrete and local positions can be grouped into overlapping kinds. So we can talk about a kind of social position, for example, a gendered position, a racialized position, or a class position. And one position can be gendered and racialized and classed at the same time. Okay, however, it's still going to be at that point very unclear how social formation works. How are the thick social positions produced, and what stabilizes them? Do patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism converge to create them? I'll argue that they're not the product of the convergence of broad systems of this sort. So those local, concrete social positions are not the result of the convergence of these three systems, or others included, because of course there are many big monolithic systems that we're dealing with. Instead, systems such as the local criminal justice system, healthcare system, and immigration system, which manage the production and distribution of resources, become interdependent, or I'll talk about co-integration, and form complex systems that are governed by multiple interacting dynamics. In effect, contemporary society is a single complex dynamic system, but then we have the question, what is intersecting or converging to create intersectionality? So if it's not these three systems, patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, eugenics, or whatever, if they're not converging to create intersectionality, what's intersecting? How do we understand it? So intersectionality, as I see it, is the result of the different dynamics at work in the system that produces social groups. Some of the dynamics are about bargaining. How do we distribute labor, and how does the distribution of labor affect our bargaining position? Some of the dynamics are about culture. What does it mean to be a mother or a Muslim? What are we supposed to do if our family breadwinner suddenly dies? How do we culture shape our options and our priorities? Other dynamics are about material conditions. What are our options when a drought destroys our crops or disease spreads through communities? These different dynamics and others embed logics of capital, gender, race, citizenship, disability, and the like, and they play out historically in complex ways. The multiple dynamics responsible for social evolution and stabilization are not intersecting systems in the sense of the term I'm going to develop. This allows us to say that a system is patriarchal. It's not patriarchy, but it's patriarchal. For example, if it includes tools to differentiate on the basis of sex markers and practices relying on those tools systematically disadvantage non-cis men. We can similarly say that a system is white supremacist or capitalist or ableist and the like. In our society, however, the same system includes tools that differentiate individuals based on many features and markings, the ones I've mentioned and others. Now you might ask, why are we going through all this? Do we really need to differentiate whether there's one or two systems, blah, blah, blah. This seems like a little remote and abstract. But I think it's helpful because our focus shifts from combating monoliths of patriarchy, white supremacy, or capitalism to challenging the historically particular dynamics that govern our local practices. Change happens when we do our part to intervene in the distinctive configuration of material and cultural conditions that shape our lives. And if we network with each other and are lucky, change can spread. Okay, but it's nobody's in charge. Like, that's one of the main messages. Nobody's in charge here. We're going to have to be a little bit lucky. Just saying. Okay, so now let's get into the details. Oppression and groups. So for this, I'm mainly going to be on the slides, but it's summarized all. So if you don't want to look at the slides, you can get it all in the handout too. Okay, as the central feature of oppression that it concerns injustice or harms to groups. For example, racial oppression concerns the oppression of non-white people. Gender oppression concerns the oppression of non-cis men. I think there's also complications with that brief summary, but I'm not going to go into it here. And this is sometimes expressed by the claim that oppression is group-based. However, I think we should distinguish two forms of group oppression. The first is what I call the discrimination model. Group-based oppression occurs when individuals are targets of wrongful treatment because of or on the basis of their group membership, their race, their gender, their citizenship, etc. This model tends to focus on individuals as the source of the wrongful treatment in the psychology of members of the privileged group and the attitudes towards those in the oppressed group. So this is often, I think the discrimination model is often seen as a kind of ethical model as opposed to a political model of oppression, because it's about individuals having bad attitudes, wrongful attitudes, and then those attitudes getting played out in the world in various ways. So the normative core, some might say, of oppression is going to be in the attitudes and dispositions of members of the dominant group. Okay, however, there's another model I'd like to suggest, which is the social formation model, where the group in question is constituted within an oppressive structure. That is, the oppressed groups are those who occupy the positions in the structure. Class is the paradigm example. Class oppression of workers happens because it's part of the structure of capitalism that labor must be exploited to gain profit. It would be odd to say that capitalism discriminates based on class, as if there's a working class independent of capitalism, and capitalism discriminates against them, right? Because, you know, capitalism is the one that produced wage laborers. So capitalism, yeah, is an oppressive system that produces wage laborers and capitalists. Note, however, that the groups formed are social groups. We're not talking about the formation of groups with a particular skin color or eyelid shape. We're talking about the construction of race, gender, and such. So this is a kind of point that those of you who know some of my work on race and gender will recognize, that I'm not, when I talk about social formation, I'm not talking about social formation of skin colors or social formation of hair textures or something like that, but social formations of race, which is distinct from that. And I also believe that social group formation need not be oppressive if the social relations making up the structure are good and just. But today we're mostly worried about those social groups who stand in an unjust system that is hierarchical in various ways. Importantly, the discrimination model and the social formation model call for different normative analyses, and I've already touched on this. Consider, what was the wrong of chattel slavery? Was the wrong of chattel slavery a matter of racial discrimination? You say slaves were racialized as black, but the moral wrong is not simply that there was racial discrimination in populating the class. The structure of chattel slavery and its creation of the master-slave relation was wrong. So this is what you might think of as the political analysis instead of the ethical analysis of oppression. What we're looking at is not just the bad attitudes of people that end up positioning others in disadvantaged social positions, but it's about how the society is structured, and the attitudes are as much a product of the structuring as they are a source of the structuring. So the two models of discrimination and social formation are compatible and build on each other. They're not competing. Once a social group is formed, sorry I left a word out there, members of the group are also discriminated against. There's a loopy interaction between them. So what happens is the members of the group, they get stabilized in some way or congealed, and then there's discrimination against members of the group in the discrimination model. So let's now look at intersectional oppression. This too I'll do mainly with the slides. This is Emma de Graffenried, and oh, I forgot to capitalize the G. In some places online, it capitalizes the G and sometimes not, and I meant to capitalize it, but I don't actually. In her obituary, I'm sorry, the G is capitalized. My bad. Okay, de Graffenried versus General Motors is the case that Kimberly Crenshaw spent time working on and used as a springboard for her analysis. Now let me give you some background. Before 1970, one woman was employed at the St. Louis Assembly Division as a janitor. Men, black and white, worked with moving machinery. Women weren't allowed to work where there was moving machinery or in areas where leaving after 9 hours would disrupt production. Because of course they had babies and they had to go home and take care of their babies. White women worked in the cushion room. The cushion room, they didn't have any machinery. I guess they must have had sewing machines, but not moving machinery, I guess. And if they left and the cushion wasn't made, it still wouldn't slow down production. Between 1970 and 1973, 155 black women were hired. And in 1974, there was a seniority-based layoff, And all of those hired after 1968 lost their jobs, including all of the black women except the janitor. Okay. So the court decided that black women as a class are not protected by Title VII, and neither women as a group nor blacks as a group suffered discrimination in this case, because the women had the option of working in the cushion room and the black men had the option of working with the machinery, and we all know this was a bad decision. Okay, so how does group oppression figure in this case? On the discrimination model, women in general are discriminated against, and black people in general are discriminated against, and women of color face double discrimination, right? They can't work in the cushion room because they're black, and they can't work in the machinery, with the machinery because they're women, and so they have this double discrimination that puts them in a very difficult situation in terms of just earning a wage. If the court can't recognize the ways in black women occupy an especially vulnerable position at the intersection of racism and sexism, then it fails to address the injustice. And this notion of intersection, like a traffic intersection, not the Venn diagram, was the one that Crenshaw had in mind. So sexism runs along one, racism runs along the other, and black women face this kind of double strike when they're in the middle. On the social formation model, we ask a different question. What was the structure of the division of labor at GM? How were employees constituted as workers in that structure? I want to suggest that the structure produced social subjects to occupy the permissible roles in a hierarchy. The structure of GM was one part of a broader system that positioned black women as cleaners doing the dirty work. And this is discussed also in a paper by Evelyn Nakano-Glenn that I'll talk about briefly in a minute. So in effect, you had people, and this blue dotted line is a kind of filtering that filters people into these different social groups. So men, both black and white, could occupy this group, women, only white, could occupy this group, and black women were left out of those two groups. But this was a process of social formation of groupness, right? These different groups, and it was consistent with the other ways that these groups were being socially formed outside of General Motors. Okay, so let's look at patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. I'm going to start by reading. This is section 4. In cases that call for the social formation model of oppression, we need a different model of intersectionality, because double discrimination is not really going to work, because we've seen there are these different ways of thinking about the formation of groups, and you're not going to get a good account of social formation intersectionality with the formation of those groups, just by thinking about discrimination. Crenshaw speaks of converging systems of race, gender, and class domination, but how should we understand the relationship between these different systems that she's talking about? Now, I want to consider very briefly the dual systems theory, and this is an example of a book, Women in Revolution, that says a discussion of the unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism. And this was a book that took up many of these issues of what is the relationship between Marxism and feminism. Are these two distinct systems? Are they one system? How do they work? So this issue about converging systems has been going on for quite a while. In dual systems theory, patriarchy controls one version. I mean, there are many versions. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but one model is one in which patriarchy controls the reproductive sphere and capitalism the economic sphere. So, Marx is supposedly dealing with production and commodity production and the fetishization of commodities and the production of surplus value and the exploitation of the workers. But as feminists have long noted, there's a domain of social reproduction. Where does the worker come from? The worker comes from women who give birth and take care of them and educate them and make them into the workers, right? So capitalism essentially depends on, and Nancy has talked about this as the hidden abode, but other aspects of this as well, that capitalism crucially depends on social reproduction, but it's not always acknowledged as such. And so one way of handling that was to say, well, look, there's a whole system of social reproduction that is run by patriarchy, and then there's another system of commodity production, et cetera, that is run by capitalism, and so we've got to figure out how these two systems converge. Okay, I think there are numerous problems with this approach, and again, different varieties of it, but in particular, and this is something that Black feminists have noted forever, women of color and poor women have never just been caregivers, and gender is constructed in the workplace as much as it is at home. And this is the mention of the Evelyn Nakano-Glenn's work. She has a paper called From Servitude to Service Work, where she offers a situated analysis of a particular social formation of domestic labor that constituted what I'm going to be calling thick gendered, raced, and classed positions, and gendered, raced, and classed subjects. So women didn't really function, as a group, didn't really function in her analysis, because women of different classes and races were deeply, differently socially positioned. And the only way you could get to something like gender would be to abstract away from that in a way that she wanted to ground in these thicker social groups. So at least within the contemporary US, I'd like to say, there's no way to be gendered simpliciter without also being racialized and classed. So if you just look at a group of people, there's no, women all appear as also members of a race or ethnicity, et cetera. That is, at a fundamental level, the divisions that we live with is these more fine-grained divisions. Okay, so next, I'm going to talk about systems and structures. Okay, so how do social processes construct such thick social categories? I'm going to give you an ontology. Here are the 5, on the handout are the 5 elements of the ontology, and then I'll explain them. Practices form networks of social relations. Networks of social relations form social structures. A system is not just a structure, but it has an internal dynamics. A system is distinguishable from its environment due to the co-integration and interdependence of its parts. And complex systems are not straightforwardly decomposable into independent parts. The operations of the parts are not necessarily linear, and they're self-organizing and stable due to feedback loops. Okay, so let me try and explain all that. Here we are, we need to coordinate. We're a bunch of random people without body, without genitalia or race or anything. No, I don't know. I love these bubble people because they're really so neutral in some sense. Anyway, so on my view, this is a practice. So a practice is going to involve a cultural techne, which is a set of public social meanings. When it goes wrong, it's an ideology. So an ideology is a kind of cultural techne, on my view. Then there are resources. They can be material, like bunnies and corn and things like that. They can also be things like time and knowledge and things that are, in some sense, abstract. And our cultural techne gives us tools for interpreting what's available down here in the resources. Then another aspect of the practice is us. We are patterned to behave in a certain way, drawing on these public social meanings that filter and shape our perception and memory and attention, and on the basis of which we can form attitudes. Then our attitudes guide action. We interact with the resources, and then the way that we interact with the resources changes them and reinforces the schemas, reinforces the social meanings. So these social meanings are not in the head, they're public. They're like a language, right? Languages, the lexicon of a language isn't, just in the head. The grammar of a language is not just in the head. Or that's what you learn at MIT anyway. Anyway, and so what we rely on are these tools. So for example, if we are in a context where bunnies are pets, then we will act toward the bunny to feed it a lot and breed it so it's big and fat and doesn't run away from us and sits on our sofas and is, fun to have around. But if our social meaning is bunnies are wild, then, we behave toward them completely differently, or food or pelt. And if you have cultural, interactions where there's different social meanings, it can be kind of hard because someone could kill your bunny and eat it, right? And it was your pet, and that's complicated. But notice that this also works when we think about people. So here is an individual. Are they a friend, a mother, or a sex object? There are different ways that we can draw on our social meanings to interpret them in their body and their, etc. And likewise, for race, is this individual a friend, a janitor, or a criminal? And depending on what's available, and the social meanings, I could direct you to more of my work on social meanings if you're interested, but they actually shape how we interact with the thing that's being interpreted and reinforce the patterns. Okay, so social practices, very briefly, to not just rely on a picture, are patterns of learned behavior that, at least in the primary instances, enable us to coordinate as member of a group in creating, distributing, managing, maintaining, and eliminating a resource or resources due to mutual responsiveness to each other's behavior and the resources in question, as interpreted through the shares, meanings, and cultural schemas, or what I've called the cultural techne. Okay, so those are practices. Here are structures and systems. So this is a system. It's a complex dynamic system. I think it's a protein. They didn't have one like this for social systems on the web. So, but you get the idea. It changes, it has nodes, it has edges, it's growing and dying and all of those sorts of things. It's very concrete and particular. It's a token thing, this system. It's actually just a picture of one, but you know what I mean. Okay, this is a structure. The structure is the skeleton of the system, and they consist of places and relations, or we might call nodes and edges if you're a graph theory. And structures can be, in dynamic as well, because they are the skeleton. So just like you can have a skeleton, one of those plastic ones that you study, and it's all very still. Skeletons actually move, and that's part of what's going on when the system evolves. Social relations are established in practices. So if you look at these little nodes and edges, so the edges here, or the relations in a social system, they're created in the context of practice. So, oops, I didn't, right. So X is a mother of Y is a biological relation, but it's also a legal and a social relation formed in practice. So you can't, if you just think those nodes and edges are made up by people who stand in the biological mother relation to people, then I don't get to stand in those relations. But because I participate in the parenting practice, I can stand in those relations, and my options are structured by those norms and by the broader cultural techne. Okay, so here is Hiroaki Kitano. I read some systems biology and systems sociology because philosophers don't talk about systems that much, and so I have to reach beyond philosophy. And this is an old textbook, but he says, in systems biology, the focus is on understanding a system's structure and dynamics. Because a biological system is not just an assembly of genes and proteins, its properties cannot be fully understood merely by drawing diagrams of their interconnections. Although such a diagram represents an important first step, it's analogous to a static roadmap, whereas what we really seek to know are the traffic patterns and why such traffic patterns emerge and how we can control them. So structure, yeah, that's good, but we need to know the dynamics so that we can see how systems are reproduced, how they're maintained, how they're disrupted, etc. Okay, so in order to talk a little bit more about the individuation of systems, I'm going to give a quick overview of the idea of co-integration. So, following Michael Murray, imagine a drunk leaving a bar and taking a walk. Let's also imagine that her dog has slipped its leash and is taking a walk in the same neighborhood. Each path may seem utterly random. The dog is distracted by every smell, the drunk is wandering befuddled. But because the dog belongs to the dog doesn't want to get too far from the drunk, and the drunk doesn't want to get too far from the dog. So when the dog barks, the drunk moves closer to the sound, and when the drunk calls out, the dog adjusts its movements toward her. The relationship between the dog and the drunk is not fixed. The dog is not on a leash, but they're probabilistically correlated. So the top line is the drunk with two dogs, the top one is her dog, and the bottom one is not her dog. This example illustrates, I think, several things. First, in some cases, apparent randomness in the behavior of an individual entity is revealed as not random once we find it to be part of a whole. This is something I also talk about in my work on structural explanation. This does not mean, however, that the behavior becomes completely predictable. Second, the behavior of each individual is explained in part by their relation to each other, to their being parts of the whole, which is the pair. In the case of the drunk and her dog, the two corrected their paths to approach each other. However, if the dog was following the drunk, but the drunk was oblivious to the dog-drunk paths would not be co-integrated. Okay, so what distinguishes a system from just random activities is that the parts of the system are co-integrated and they interact with each other and they are probabilistically correlated in a way that they aren't with the environment. So the weather could affect what the drunk and the dog were doing if it started to rain or snow or whatever, but that's not co-integrated because the dog and the drunk don't affect the weather. It's only a one way. Internal to the system, there's this two-way co-integration. Okay. So let's move on. Well, I think we can think of, just keep in mind that these kinds of complex systems are like the weather and climate and beehives and all sorts of things. They're all over the place. Once you start looking for complex dynamic systems, it's like they're everywhere. And it's another important feature of them that they have emergent properties, that because the interaction, the co-integrative interaction, cuts across levels. So that's an important, interesting point. Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples of co-integrated systems. Jose Mendoza characterizes crimigration this way. Crimigration is a term used by migration scholars to refer to three areas in which criminal law enforcement and immigration law enforcement are problematically conflated. The first is when criminal convictions come to have immigration consequences, such as a revocation of a visa or a green card. The second is when immigration law violations have come to have criminal-style punishments. And the third is when the tactics sanctioned for criminal law enforcement are commandeered for the purposes of performing immigration enforcement or vice versa. Another example that is really meaningful to me, and I've actually written a bit about, is Child Protective Services and its connection to criminal justice. And Dorothy Roberts has documented the co-integration of child protective services and criminal justice. Here's a quote: "The symbiotic relationship between law enforcement and child welfare agencies systematically buttresses a police state in Black communities by triggering investigations into family life, reinforcing family surveillance with armed might, and threatening families with both prison and child removal. Poverty, because it's correlated with difficulty in providing for a child's basic needs, itself is considered a basis for removal, and this has been the case for decades. And of course, involvement with the criminal justice system affects one's employment options. This is also really important in thinking about the Dobbs decision and the Dobbs decision where the justices said oh, there will be no problem in finding a perfectly adequate home for a newborn if the mother doesn't want to care for it. And actually, in Black and brown communities, what's going to happen if the child goes into foster care is they're likely, very, very likely, to end up in the criminal justice system, and et cetera. Okay, so there's a reason why poor Black and brown mothers do not want to relinquish their newborns to the fire station. Okay, so sorry, I get all kind of upset about things like that. Okay, so intersectionality and convergence. So this is the background notion of a system that I'm working with. So how do we think about the convergence of systems? Because that's what we're trying to understand. I don't think it's plausible to say that intersectionality in the context of social formation, because there is that other discriminatory, double discrimination one. I'm not trying to say there isn't that, there is that. But if we're talking about social formation, intersectionality, I think it's not plausible to say that it's a convergence between patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism functioning autonomously. First, the big three, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, are not the systems at issue that are doing the social formation. The relevant systems that do social formation are criminal justice, immigration, and child protective services in the examples I offered. So here I'm insisting on attention to the concrete local formations and how specific practices oppress. And they oppress in very historically and contingently complicated ways. Oops, why did third go next? Okay, let's go, wait a minute. Okay, here's second. Second, if we're focusing on concrete social formations, the relevant oppressed groups are not, at least in the first instance, women or Black or brown people or the poor. They produce groups that cut across gender, race, and class. So poor Black mothers, for example, is a paradigm that we just talked about. And third, the particular subsystems are co-integrated, thus forming a single system with complex dynamics and looping effects. And the local coordination, sort of co-integration in the case of, say, the child protective services and the criminal justice system, that then spreads because other systems become co-integrated with that, or was already co-integrated. So our current social system, and others like it, is sexist, racist, and capitalist. Gender and race as kinds of positions emerge when the management of resources involves categorizing or marking individuals to fulfill different roles in the structure, and sex, color, or other forms of vulnerability are or become salient ways to do so. So here are a variety of markers that you can notice. This was actually the first iconographic representation of race in a certain era, and it was just like, whoa, oh my God, fascinating though. And so the markers are going to be what is in the cultural that is available as a marker becomes part of the cultural techne that gets built into the practice, and then through that practice, individuals are formed and groups are formed. Okay, so system dynamics and cultural logics. Let's see. Okay. Granted, it may be that patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism aren't separate systems, they're deeply co-integrated, but isn't it still plausible that our current social formation is controlled by capitalism? And I'm very indebted to Nancy Fraser's work and sort of thinking through this challenge, because I think her work is amazing and she's very convincing. Isn't patriarchy a capitalist formation that functions in a process, in processes of social reproduction? Isn't white supremacy a capitalist formation that functions in a process of expropriation? And isn't all of this best understood as the mechanisms of capitalism, the logic of capitalism just playing itself out? Well, the dynamics of culture are multiple and complex. And now I'm going to read a quote on the handout. The network of semiotic relations that make up culture is not isomorphic with the network of economic, political, geographical, social, or demographic relations that make up what we usually call a society. A given symbol, mother, red, polyester, liberty, wage labor, dirt, is likely to show up not only in many different locations in a particular institutional domain, motherhood in millions of families, but in a variety of different institutional domains as well. Welfare mothers as a potent political symbol, the mother tongue in linguistic quarrels, the mother of God in the Catholic Church. Culture may be thought of as a network of semiotic relations cast across society, a network with different shape and different spatiality than institutional or economic or political networks. The meaning of a symbol in a given context may therefore be subject to redefinition by dynamics entirely foreign to the institutional domain or spatial location. Yes, so economic logics, political logics, sexual logics, caregiving logics interact and evolve in response to each other and the system's environment. Not only the logic of capitalism, but the logics of race, gender, eugenics, age, etc., and those that emerge in particular social formations are crucial in explaining and disrupting the systems that oppress us. And here is an example. I got this from a paper called Cultural Logic and the Modes of Consumption, Unraveling the Multiplicity of Symbolic Distinctions Among Concert Audiences. Anyway, I just think it's very interesting. It does have class involved because highbrow, lowbrow is really important, but there are many other dimensions of what is or affecting or constraining or enabling people to go to concerts. Okay. I think that, so for the conclusion, I'm going to just read because I wasn't sure how far I would get on by now. So hear me read. So I think the fluidity of culture is a reason for hope. This is on the handout. For social meanings are not controlled by the state or law or the economy. It's a domain where the oppressed have some power. The idea that there is a logic of capitalism that is running the show is not only reductionist, but is also insensitive to the complexity of social dynamics. It may be that any adequate explanation of the dynamics of our social formation must take capitalism into account, which I believe, but I would say that the logics of gender, race, and other much more specific social practices also have explanatory significance and liberatory potential. So let's move to the conclusion. In a way, I started the paper with a summary conclusion. And rather than going back and doing that summary, you've got it if you want to look back at it, you get a feel for how the whole picture is supposed to fit together. I'm going to go back to the political and representational intersectionality. So I think a further advantage of the account I've just sketched is it can illuminate how these different forms are interconnected, how political discourse and cultural imagery also function in systems of domination. Structural intersectionality is connected to representational intersectionality because the cultural logics built into our practices do not parse gender and race as such, as distinct elements, right? The cultural imagery, I had this picture and I took it out. The cultural imagery of a ballerina, this delicate ballerina, right? Whiteness all over it. That's all you can see is a white woman. Of course there are black ballerinas. Of course there are ballerinas of many different ethnic groups. But the iconography of a ballerina is totally about white femininity, I believe. The dominant. Also I should say, there are also subaltern communities and all kinds of counterpublics where this is not the way it works. But I'm talking about the dominant system here. Okay, they don't parse gender and race as separate elements. The social meanings that produce thick positions are not decomposable into a gender part and a race part. The cultural tools shape our perception and responsiveness to other bodies in a way that constructs what it is to be gendered as a way of being raced, and vice versa. So no wonder there's a kind of intersectional representational intersectionality, because the images that we're working with, what Collins would call the controlling images, are images of racialized, gendered, able-bodied or not individuals. And so that's where the two are connected. And this comes in because on my account of social systems and social practices, there is this cultural techne that is playing a crucial role. Structural intersectionality is connected to political intersectionality because those occupying different positions within the structure have different interests. Women don't all occupy the same thick position, nor do all members of a race. And political solidarity is a struggle because gender and race are not social positions in a system. At best, they're kinds of social positions. So what we need to do to build political solidarity is to be sensitive to the many kinds of social positions that individuals are occupying and the conflicts and, between them and the ways in which not everybody's interests are going to be met in the same way. So to wrap up, one might wonder why the social ontology of systems, which is the topic I've addressed today, matters when our goal is to promote social justice. The fact is, it often doesn't matter. I find, however, that it's important to keep in mind that no one is in charge of complex systems. So we can't say, oh, lawyers, legislators, whatever, go fix it, right? Fix the law, fix this. No fat chance. It's not gonna help. You can't have philosophers, oh, like, where is the tipping point we can find right here with the moral wrong of implicit bias? We're gonna give everybody implicit bias training and then it's gonna make everything better. No. That no one is in charge of complex systems, and although some individuals and subsystems have much more power than others, and that's something I haven't really talked sufficiently about today, but it's a huge issue, it's still the case that complex systems can change quickly and dramatically when small changes cascade. That's one of the results of the non-linearity, is that a cascade can happen with a very small change. Global capitalism seems too huge to confront, and I'm not optimistic that the alleged contradictions it harbors will take it down. But understanding how everyday practices are embedded in systems and how culture shapes our behavior to enact the system can reveal, I think, where some of the leverage points are. Social theory cannot itself change anything, but social movements with good social theory in hand may open possibilities for a less awful world. Thank you very much.
So I think we'll have Q&A. There are a couple microphones, and so I think, well, we take some time to line up for questions, and we'll just go back and forth. So.
And I know I threw a lot at you today, so if you have questions, just a clarification, what did I mean here? And, oh, didn't I say two different things at different places, or, you know, whatever. Just feel free. I'm happy to try to explain or also take criticisms. Brave soul starting us off.
So please.
Hi, thank you so much for this. So my question is, I think, broadly clarificatory, and just following up on the last part of your conclusion. So, I mean, one concern, right, with complex systems is that they are fundamentally unpredictable in a way. So, I mean, basically all of this seems very plausible to me, but it also does make me worried as a consequence of how much can we, in fact, intervene, because it seems like you can take this unpredictably on a sort of scale where on the one hand there's basically nothing you can do, and like tipping one thing here might make things much worse, in fact, and you didn't see that. But you seem to suggest that there were sort of, that we can do changes if we're sort of sufficiently informed by intervening in particular parts of kind of complex systems. So I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that. Just generally, would you see some avenues for sort of intervention and positive effects?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I do think that it's tricky, and that people will often go into social activism sort of with this idea that we've got to figure out the costs and benefits of this particular intervention and then weigh them up, and then we'll decide what to do, where it's, you know, in a complex dynamic system, that kind of precise weighing up of the costs and benefits is going to be very difficult. But there are regularities. So think of the drunk and her dog, right? It's not that, you know, yes, if there had been an earthquake, it would have been that the drunk and the dog might have gotten separated because the dog freaked out and bolted in another direction or something. But under where the environment is remaining somewhat stable, you can get pretty robust regularities that will give you a sense that this is a better rather than a worse way to go. And so I think I agree with you that it's both a blessing and a curse for it to be a complex system, because small changes can have cascading effects, but also you can't quite tell which of the small changes is going to have the cascade in which direction, or you can't be certain of it, but you can have probabilistic information about it. So I think that one of the interesting cascades, in a way, that's happened in the last 20 years is a cultural transformation in the techne around gender and sexuality, right? This is something that happens in counterpublics, it happens in subaltern communities, that there's a kind of, this draws on Liz's work somewhat too, Liz Anderson's work too, that in those communities there's a kind of trial and error for alternative practices, alternative norms, alternative ways of interacting. And then there comes a point when bringing that out of those communities into the public, it's a risky venture, right? It's a risky venture, but it did cascade in a positive direction, I think. And so I think that's a very good example where what you have is a change in what gender means and in the social meaning of gender and the disruption of gender. And in this case, I was often talking about gender assuming a binary, but of course now we don't have to assume the binary anymore. So the markers don't always do the work that they used to do, and there's a kind of disruption. Now, of course, we're getting the Florida's backlash and other backlash, but I think the horse has left the barn, right? And so that would be the kind of example. Was that helpful?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I don't see anyone at the other mic yet, so I'll just maybe, to follow up, ask you, like, would you like to speculate on further sort of interventions that we could see social movements doing today that haven't sort of left the barn yet in a similar way?
Other besides the issues of gender and, well, I think that there are interventions around, George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, that there's a change in the social meaning of police brutality. I mean, it's both more visible, but it's been there all along, right? It has been there all along. But there's been a kind of a paradigm shift. So this is another part of the epistemology behind all of this. So I believe that part of what consciousness raising does is offer a paradigm shift. And what we've got to do, and this drawing in part on the Combahee River Collective, what you do is you begin in small groups to develop an alternative frame for understanding what's going on. And that gives you a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift, it's very hard to go backwards after that, after you've seen it through the better paradigm. There's, of course, lots of questions about what a better paradigm is, blah, 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 all that. I would be happy to talk more about it if there's no one else who wants to talk. But I do think that those kinds of paradigm shifts are happening in a lot of different places right now. Even the fact that socialism was discussed in the last election as if, with Bernie, as something that Americans would take seriously. I mean, that's a paradigm shift as well. So these cultural interventions, I also think that there's going to be a huge impact of the material conditions, of course, because, in the picture of practices, there's the individuals, there's the cultural techne and the material conditions. So one of the things you can do is go on strike, because going on strike changes the material conditions, because people can't access things, can't do things, whatever. So going on strike is all kinds of direct action are ways of interfering with the material conditions to kind of force a rethinking. Again, this draws on Liz's work as well. But I think one of the biggest ones right now is climate change, right? Because climate change is this profound change in the material conditions, and we need new paradigms for how to form communities and how to move communities from one region to another, and enabling them to maintain their integrity and their cultural traditions and things like that. So I think that climate change is like a big one in terms of prompting new systems, new structures, new laws, new understandings, and new cultural technique.
Hi, thanks for this talk. This has been really great. So I have more of just a small clarificatory question. I was interested in point number 4 on page 2 of your handout about systems and structures.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that a system is distinguishable from its environment and due to the co-integration and interdependence of its parts. So I'm sort of wondering to what degree is it distinguishable from its environment? Does that mean it's independent from its environment or in some way? I imagine a lot of times a system is sort of the product of its environment, right? So I would just be interested to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure, that's great. So individuating systems is a fool's, task. It's just not. It's very hard to do, and very often what you have to do to individuate a system has to be a response to a particular kind of question, and I'm a believer in theories as answers to questions. But what I had in mind is there are open systems and closed systems. I don't know where you went. Where did you just go? I was talking. There you are. You walked off and then I couldn't. So there are open systems and closed systems. Closed systems is the environment doesn't matter. It's just doing its own thing. There are very few, nothing social is a closed system. They're all open systems because our bodies, kind of affect what we're capable of. Well, that was a bad example. Anyway, but our environment, like the weather, include. So the difference is that in an open system, there's only a one-way influence. It's not a two-way influence. So that's what I was talking about in the drunk and her dog. It might be a rainstorm, and that affects what they do. So there's the one-way influence of the environment on the system, but the system doesn't turn around then and change whether it rains or not. And so the rain or the climate doesn't count as part of the system. But when you have the drunk and her dog, they're both parts of the system because they each are affecting each other. And to explain what's going on with one, you've got to talk about the other and vice versa. So does that help?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
So it's kind of a question in a similar vein, mostly clarificatory. I was wondering, a very similar question, but in the sense of we have a cultural system that creates these, or cultural techne as you use, that creates these images, these ideas, these sort of accessible symbols in different contexts that are sort of inspired by what we view, say like the ballerina you gave example of, or the rabbit. And I was a little confused on how that relates to patriarchy, white supremacism, and capitalism. Are you saying, to understand your ontology, are you saying that the cultural techne that we're working within can be patriarchal
Yes.
as an adjective, it can be capitalistic,
Yes.
and it can be white
Yes.
supremacist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the idea. So I think of these cultural logics, and this is, I'm talking across so many different literatures, but within the kind of anti-capitalist Marxian sort of debates, these idea of cultural logics, and that's always like puzzled me, like what is a cultural logic? But I think it's a complicated notion. I'm not completely getting all of it. But one of the ways I'm incorporating that in my view is that I'm thinking of them as a kind of dynamics within the system. So the system, remember, isn't just a static structure. is like that protein that's, going like this. So you've got to have a story about, if to understand the system, of why it's moving in this direction and why it's evolving in that direction. And they are self-maintaining, but they also they can improve or get worse because they are dynamic and they evolve in different ways. And so when you're trying to understand it, you've got to get a sense of, well, what are the dynamics that are in play that are moving it in one direction or stabilizing it? And so my view about cultural logics is they're part of the dynamics of what's going on. And so some of them are going to be kind of just bargaining dynamics. So, I mean, Kaylin O'Connor has some really interesting work about how if you mark men and women as individuals who are apt for a certain place in the division of labor, and the place for women is to take care of dependents, then they're systematically going to be disadvantaged in bargaining because they will take a worse option to protect their dependent. And so the person who doesn't have a dependent will be able to exploit that, right? So that is a bargaining logic that is coded to gender. There are bargaining logics that are coded to a worker, manager, worker, capitalist, employer, or something like that. That people enter into bargaining marked in a certain way, and that marking can end up, and the marking is connected to the role they play and the group they're a member of, but that then can make them systematically disadvantaged, and so that's a logic because that's going to maintain the disadvantage over time. So that was an example of a kind of logic, a kind of bargaining logic, but that involves these markers, the markers of the body of a person who, anyway. But what I'm arguing is that there are many of these cultural logics and dynamics that are playing a role in what happens in the evolution of a system, of a social system. And so I was just there trying to suggest that capitalism was not the only one, but we can say that a system is patriarchal if it has one of these cultural logics that picks out people of different genders and assigns them to different roles, and then those roles disadvantage them. Then it's a patriarchal system.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, could I have just a follow-up clarification?
It's up to the chair. I don't have to do it.
Okay. So is it then like a kind of like a monist system, like there's one large like cultural techne, or is there just several different ones that are working in tandem or slightly?
So I believe that that societies are deeply fragmented, and that's a blessing actually, because it enables the possibility of critique, because we occupy these different places. So I think that each practice has its own techne, and we end up in different sets of practices where the technes are very different and they don't always cohere. But I do think that there's some dominant technes that are like what's normal is natural, what's natural is good, right? That's a big one. We ought to. I mean, a certain capitalist sort of general platitudes that you find all over the place. But one of the things, so let me give you a tiny example of this. So my sister, who's 12 years older than I am, went to an all-women's high school and all-women's college, and then studied education and decided she was going to be a school teacher, and then didn't like school teaching, and so she quit and had kids and stayed home for a long time. And then she went back to work, and I said, Mary, how do you like being back at work? And she said, well, it's really interesting because at work, which has its own workplace techne, at work, I get credit for the least little thing I do. She's very organized, very efficient, very smart. I get credit, I do the littlest thing in sort of fixing something, and everybody's like, yay, Mary, whatever. I never get that at home. I can like take care of the kids and do this brilliant stuff, and nobody ever gives me credit for anything. So I like that about work. She says, what I don't like about work is that when I was at home, I could eat lunch whenever I wanted. I didn't have to eat it from 12 to 1. And this is really a hassle. So here she's sort of moving between these different sets of practices with their different technes, and it gives her the resources to sort of criticize. Each one gets criticized in light of the other. I should say she was much more effective in changing the lunch hour rules than she was in changing her family, but oh well. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you so much.
This is an invitation to say more about how you're thinking about changing systems, given the kind of tension that like no one's in charge,
Yep.
but also as you acknowledge, there are individuals and subsystems that have more power. And so given the fact that there are going to be, I don't know if the individuals and subsystems are nodes or what they are in the system, but like, given that there are individuals and subsystems that may have had like a larger hand in creating the system and maintaining the system and have a vested interest in keeping the system the way that it is. So they're not in charge. So maybe
Yes.
like, affecting them isn't going to change the system. But like, I guess like, how do you think of that? Like, does affecting those nodes or individuals or subsystems with more power have a greater effect on changing the system, or are you just thinking that it's not like that?
So I think that there are lots of, so you have to have a big toolbox, and there's not going to be a single strategy that works in all cases. Going on strike is a good way to affect those in power, because if they need to fulfill their mission and you're making it impossible for them to fulfill their mission, then so organizing more generally, organizing amongst those people who are directly affected. But as I mentioned, political intersectionality can make that very difficult because we're not all coming with the same interests and the same needs in these situations. So organizing is one way to deal with groups in power or others in power. And then organizing can take place, can do direct action, or it can form alternative institutions. So I think practices of mutual support and that can build out so that people stop relying on those in power and rely on each other for mutual aid and mutual support. I think there's going to be ways in which you can work through the system to lobby. So even though the state is not in charge, they have a lot of power and there are lots of incentives. So you can work through the system to try and change. Is this addressing the questions you had?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So yeah, and sometimes violence is necessary, but preferably not.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for this talk. And thanks for all the work that you've done over the years to make these kinds of discussions something that kind of belong in the philosophical mainstream, because it's great to it's great to have these debates happening here. My question was about the sort of, I guess it's kind of like your conclusion, which you talk about at the beginning of the paper, about how when you're thinking about the sort of thick social positions and how they're produced, how you think that it's not quite right to say that white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy combine to create them, and that they're created by these sort of local systems in combination. So one thing I was thinking about is, it seems like if we want to explain some of these thick social positions, like maybe the sort of crimmigration example, what we might look to when we're thinking about explaining like what's going on there, why is that happening, what's the function of kind of what's going on here, is we'd look to these local systems, as you talk about, the sort of local immigration system, the local criminal justice system. But then it seems like the next step would be to think about, okay, what sort of function do these local immigration systems and criminal justice systems play more broadly? And so then we'd be thinking about, okay, with the immigration system, well, what functions does it play? Well, one function is to kind of control labor, control who can sort of, come and go, control, create racial hierarchies, sort of manage groups of people, and sort of use various status and legal kind of hierarchies to control those groups of people. And same with the criminal justice system, we'd be thinking about control of labor, control of kind of economic classes, control of racial hierarchies. So it seems like once we go the next step from thinking about the local institutions, we do end up wanting to think about these sort of broader big systems like white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy. So I'm wondering if you think there's this sort of important explanatory role when we're thinking about the social kind of function of these local systems. There's a sort of important role to play with these big social systems in explaining, like, why do we have these local systems? Yeah. Why do they exist? What function do they play? Why are they going to be recreated in lots of different forms, even if they're changed slightly? Like, why will we end up with something like the criminal justice system under capitalism? So this is sort of maybe speaking to the point about, you know, the logics of capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy and why they might need certain local systems in order to operate.
Yes, that's a great question. And so I think it's very tempting when you go that next step to think that capitalism is going to be an overarching explanatory, tool that will dominate other tools. But if you think about why are people so worried about the southern border and not the northern border, right? I mean, there are more people coming for the southern border, but I don't think that's the only reason. And there are more people who are going to do menial work coming from the southern border. But I think that there's a cultural anxiety about the destruction of whiteness and the culture that of kind of Christian heteropatriarchy, Christian racist heteropatriarchy is at risk here. And I don't think that that's just an economic fear, or the best explanation is not purely economic or purely capitalist. I think that there's a kind of cultural anxiety there. So I think in some cases, when you look to these broader, the broader search for explanation, you're going to get a capitalist logic as really effective in understanding the process of what's happening. But I think that logic is interacting with the white supremacist logic and the culture of, I also think there's stuff about Christianity in here and sort of some weird sense of what we've always been. So there's a kind of historical narrative there that has great force and that motivates people to vote for people in various ways. So we need a complex and more diversified a set of tools to do the explanation. And that's all I wanted to say, is that it's, these things are working together, but the techne that is sort of posing the questions and telling us what are okay answers are really very complicated. Is that a good enough answer?
Yeah, thank you.
That's just a start at an answer. That's all I want to say. But I want to acknowledge the main point that yes, we have to look to the broader phenomenon, but then what is the broader phenomenon? Is it capitalism, or is it this system that has got all of these dynamics that are interacting and interdependent?
Thanks so much.
Hi. That's loud. Thank you so much. So I have a question about one of the upshots of Section 4, and it might just be like asking you to go over some of that a little bit more slowly in the details. So one of the upshots is like we need to direct our attention to the sort of local stuff going on. And I got a little lost in the relationship between the local forces and the global forces. So yeah, can you just say a little bit more about what the relationship between the local forces and the global forces is? I'm particularly interested in like their role in sort of creating these social positions, and then also like types of social positions. Just like one example, there probably are better ones, is like a jail in one town versus like sort of the criminal justice system. How do those things work together to create the social position of like criminal?
Yeah, great question. So one of the thrusts of what I'm trying to think about, and this is a little bit of a sidebar, and I'll come back to the question, is, I work in a program at MIT called D-Lab that I teach there, and I do research there now, which attempts to solve global poverty issues by going into communities and teaching our partners in those communities the design process so that they develop solutions to their own problems with the resources that they have available, and these skills are transposable to other kinds of contexts. And it has been very, very powerful to work on this and to see how difficult it is when you're in a particular setting that's quite different from one you're used to fully grasp both the challenges and the dynamics of what's possible and what's not possible given the cultural conditions. And I think that one thing that I'm probing here is how can we think about social change and how can we think about social formation that is down in the nitty-gritty of those day-to-day interactions with people, because that's where so much happens. And so what and this is where my work on practices is supposed to be down at that very micro level of thinking about how people in rural Kenya manage their menstrual periods, right? How do they do that? And what does it mean that they don't have menstrual products? How does that affect their lives? What do they have to do? And just so you know, in the region where I work, teenage girls have sex with Buddha boys, who are the delivery boys, because they will give them menstrual products, and then they can go to school, right? So this is how do we explain what's going on there? It seems to me that talking about patriarchy or capitalism is too crude a tool for trying to explain what's actually happening and how these particular social positions of these particular individuals occurs. Okay, so the practice part of it is supposed to be getting us down into the formation through the culture. In this case, there's a lot of Christianity, and that through the material conditions that's very, very impoverished, and et cetera, all of that. So that's supposed to be helping us unpack some of the dynamics there in that. But then you start to see that across Africa, this is not uncommon, right? There's in Latin America, the menstruation is a huge issue for for young women, as is of course birth control and many other things, that has an effect on whether they stay in school and whether they leave school and then go into and then are become rapeable, so to speak. I mean, it's a large. So when you start to look across the what you begin to see is that there are patterns, and we have to take those patterns into account. But what I think is that when we take those patterns into account, we can't just stay at the general level and think we've got a solution, because the solution requires us to sort of recognize that these dynamics of class and and culture and gender and all of these things are even across these areas of life and community and country are playing a role. Is this responsive?
Yeah, that example is super helpful. That's
Okay.
great. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm not sure how close to get to the microphone. Thank you so much for this. I have a question, I guess, particularly on the phrase and the word, cultural techne.
Yeah.
So I think of techne as, so like the Greek is like skilled craft production with a physical output. I feel like ideology, it governs the production of an object, and it changes and hopefully like goads on the way to character development, the individuals engaged in it. I don't know if how you've been using it is meant to kind of track that, or if by cultural techne you mean something like descriptive properties or something more like governing principle. So I was wondering just a clarification about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I use the term techne for a couple of reasons. One is because when people just talk about culture, everyone goes, what do you mean? Like What is it? I don't know what it is. And so I needed to have a technical term so I could differentiate it from many of the other uses of the term culture. I too think of a techne as a skill, but I think of the skill as a use of tools of various kinds that are made available and a method for using those tools, right? So it's not just the habituation of an individual, but it's a way of taking up tools that are shared with other people who have the techne, right? That's the idea. When you learn a techne so think of apprenticeship. What you do when you develop the techne is learn how to use the tools from the expert, and then you develop you have the habituation. So what I think, the reason why I was especially interested in this is that I think that it's a bit of a slippage because I'm interested in the techne as those public tools that are taken up by individuals who become fluent social subjects, right? So a fluent social subject is a skill. It's a skill that you have to learn how to read facial expressions and clothing and body gait and all of these things. You have to learn what's eaten around here and what time you eat and all of those sorts of things. So there's all of this knowledge that you have to gain, propositional knowledge that you have to gain in order to be able to develop the techne in the sense of the skill and habituation. So what I'm doing with using the notion of techne is try to talk about the fluent social subject in a public way of reading, interpreting, and responding to these external cues.
Yeah, so I think that's, can I very quickly? I think that's very helpful. I worry, I guess, about the habituating practices being like inherently virtue producing, so like on Mac.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah, so I guess that's why, yeah, so I worry about that for using the word techne, I guess.
Yeah, no,
basically.
techne,
yeah.
But I think you can, burglars can have a techne, right? They're really good at stealing shit.
So, yeah, so he would say that it's not a craft because it inherently is like self-dissolving.
Really, you're going to hold me to that? I mean, no. But it's called, so this in Althusser is called interpolation. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that we become interpolated as social subjects, and as interpolated as a social subject is to be socially fluent. Typically, an ideological interpolation is we're interpolated into being subjects who reproduce injustice and the horrors that we know. And so what I'm interested in is how that interpolation requires a public language. So this is as Sewell often says, the ubiquitous analogy with language. You have a grammar and you have a lexicon to speak a language, and you do it fluently. You don't have to think about the grammar and the lexicon, it just happens. Socially skilled people, there's a public grammar and lexicon for socially acceptable behavior, and you learn it and you enact it, right? You act different, you make different eye contact and you stand a different distance with, but also you get the idea.
No, yeah, I think that's very helpful. Thank you. It's governing and productive, I think. So
yes.
Thank you.
I just want to first say this is a wonderful, wonderful lecture.
Oh, thank you.
And I was so excited, I'm an immunologist, that you showed the protein as an example of a dynamic complex system. And I think one of the things that I took away from your talk was that there really are similarities between what's happening in complex systems within systems. For example, a protein within a cell within a system, and multiple systems within an organism.
Yeah.
And so it was crystal clear, so clear for even me, a non-philosopher, to understand. But here's a question, I have two questions. In many ways, interventions, if you do it in an organism, if you do, for example, clinical trials, you make assumptions in a local, either at a protein level or within a cell or within one system, and then you take a gamble and hope that doesn't have unforeseen consequences for the entire multi-system organism. It's sort of kind of similar to the complexity of trying to have an intervention in terms of social injustice situation within not only a local community, but an entire civilization or
Yes.
world.
Yes.
So I see that analogy, and it's very powerful. What has happened in the biomedical sciences with time, even during the past 50 years or so that I've been engaged, is the innovation of ways to assess multiple things that were not possible 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I assume that's happened in social science as well. Much of that has happened at the University of Michigan, but elsewhere. So the first question is, you're in a sea of systems biologists at MIT.
Yes.
And there's a broad institute, and they can share their experiences on interventions that are premised upon local intervention within a protein or a cell, and how that goes wrong and doesn't go wrong. And biologists find that incredibly instructive in providing boundaries and frameworks in to try to make the best guesses towards interventions that won't be deleterious, right? So the question is, do you have conversations in the sea of biologists at MIT, and has that been instructive? And the reason why I ask that is that I believe that interdisciplinary dialogue is often mutually beneficial. So that first question is, have you done that? And the second question is, if I look in my field, there are a multitude of tools, microbiomes, multi-omics, things that didn't exist when I was a graduate student, that now allow you to better predict and see the impact of a particular intervention on a complex multi-system situation like an individual. So those are the two questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so I'm a deep believer, as you probably can tell, in interdisciplinarity. I mean, I spend most of my time now reading non-philosophy and talking to non-philosophers, but that may have something to do with my department. And I haven't talked to the systems biologists, but MIT has a whole department of systems engineering, right? It's not about just biologists. They just do systems work, right? They talk about systems. And the people I've mainly talked with are people in the Sloan School, which is the School of Business, because they're closer, a little, it's a bigger step to talk about biology because I don't really know that much biology. But the people in Sloan, we actually I've got money from the International Society for Social Ontology, or International Social Ontology Society, to do a small workshop where we're getting some people from Harvard and MIT and some other philosophers of biology together to talk about systems in the fall. Because we believe that what we want is to see how the research, the empirical research on how this has worked, and there are interventions on things like obesity. I mean, obesity is a really interesting case study, I think. There are other interventions in economics where the economists are trying to figure out how you intervene in certain ways to cascade a positive effect and such like that. So we're bringing some of them in together. Raj Chetty, do you know Raj Chetty? Anyway. Yeah, I think so. I'm just a philosopher. I mean, I think that I don't do empirical work so much. I mean, I read empirical work and I read about networks. I mean, so the real issue where there is research is how building networks, because it's like building the edges to make to another node. Building those networks out in certain directions can have a huge positive effect. And so this has to do with the organizing. I can't remember who asked the question about organizing. So organizing, what it does is it builds those networks. And once you have a other network, it can have a positive or negative, because you can also build terrible networks, and that's what some people have done in this country. But what we have to do is think about building networks that then can develop a kind of power in the system and cause the system to evolve in a slightly different way. Does that make sense? Okay.
All right, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have a comment more than a question, but you can sort of take it whatever direction you like, and it's to point out what I think could be an interesting implication of your conclusion that individuals aren't in charge of the complex system and that large-scale changes could happen in perhaps really weird, random, strange, small places. And the implication, I take it, could be on the objects of moral admiration. And it could turn out that often the changers really are not these like moral heroes who have this like profound moral insight and clarity into the system, but it could just be these small everyday people who are just standing up for one thing or another, and it just cascades from there. And so I guess, to kind of put it concisely, one implication of your conclusion could be that often the objects of moral admiration are just going to be accidental heroes or heroines or just kind of characters and groups that bring about large-scale changes without an awareness that that's what they're trying to do. So that's the comment.
So let me give you a little more information about that I think is fascinating. So Cass Sunstein has been working on this project about what it takes for someone to throw themselves into a situation to promote the good, say. So he uses this example of where he was in, I don't know where, somewhere in the Middle East, and there was a man who appeared to be beating his child, and the child was screaming and whatever, and the person he was with ran out and tried to stop him. And Cass says, "Oh man, I wasn't going to do that." This was called a oneer, where you can be the one to go and does it. You don't have to have anyone else doing it. But Cass said, he's a twoer. So as soon as his friend went, he followed his friend. And some people are threeers, and some people are fourers, and some people are 10,000ers, right? About who's going to take the lead. But if you've got a oneer and a couple twos around them, and then a couple threeers around them, and a couple fourers around them, then you can actually, it can make a difference. It can make a huge difference. But we are dispositionally different in what it's going to take for us to throw ourselves out there into the situation. And I think this is kind of connected to what you say. It doesn't have to be a big thing. You stop the man from beating his child or whatever. You throw yourself into a situation. And yeah, there's risks. You might get beaten up, or you might be told, I misunderstand the situation. They're just practicing the part in his child's play, or I don't know what. But to take those risks, I think matters.
Thank you.
Hi, it's so nice to meet you. I'm very starstruck. So I have a question. I really like what you were saying about the regularly occurring patterns and the correlations. And I was thinking about the case with the dog and the drunk. And it seems like in addition to the correlations, there's like a causal story that we tell about why the dog follows the drunk. And maybe the same for the story you want to tell about justice here at night. So I suppose I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on the relationship between the patterns we observe and the causal story, and in specific, what would disqualify something as a causal story that matches our patterns. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that's a hard question. Let me see if I've got the question. So the question is, in the case of the dog and the drunk, if you just look at the drunk or just look at the dog, it looks totally random. It's just whoa, that drunk is totally drunk, and random behavior, and dog, whoa. Then you see a pattern that the dog and the drunk are co-integrated, right? They're responding to each other. And then the question is, how do you know when you've got a causal correlation a causal connection rather than a mere correlation? Yes. Go ask the causal theorist. I think you've got counterfactual dependence, right? They're counterfactual. So I'm just going to go with that. You've got a kind of counterfactual dependence between going both ways. And we know that counterfactual dependence, you've got overdetermination and you've got blah, 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 blah. But start there. And then go ask your favorite causal theorist what more you need. I can point you to some. I actually live with one. So, but I'm not going to try and answer that question. Sorry. It's a kind of, I used to follow that, but I haven't recently. Where are things now with the causal theory literature? I'm sorry about that.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the great talk. So my question is more on the side of the process of asking questions such as these. And it is around when we go about asking questions about social formations and the people within them, especially when we're relating that to the real world, it becomes very natural to place the people into their social formations and talk about them in that regard. So the white man as the dominator and the black woman as the dominated. However, this categorization can become so habitual that I feel like when you look at situations where these questions are asked, whether it be individual researchers or classrooms or departments, these people become reduced to only being able to represent their social formations. So my question is, how do we prevent that from becoming the kind of status quo, where it is impossible to conceive of these people in the real world outside of their social formations, because that is so much the habit of the questions that we ask?
So I see you as there's two questions that I would like help, because I just need help. So on one hand, it's how do we, in our day-to-day lives, not just stereotype and pigeonhole people and interact with them as if they are their social formation. And the other is how do we do research that doesn't, just reduce all of the issues to the issues of social formation. It was one or the other your...
So I'm more interested in the research space, especially things like the classroom, in which we are consistently asking these questions and trying to solve these problems, and thus placing people discussing these social formations. How do we prevent that from becoming the way that we structure our thinking?
In the classroom or in the research?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I'm not really an expert on pedagogy. I'm just kind of try to do it and do thoughtful. But I think of a bunch of things that happen in a classroom, like where we ask the black person to speak for all black people, and we ask, the lesbian to speak for all lesbians, or the trans person to speak for all trans people. And we know that's not a good thing to do, right? That's a really bad thing to do. A lot of what I do in class to try and help with that is, at the very beginning of the class, have rules of engagement and sort of try to disrupt people's assumptions. So even the icebreaker, you have to, in the icebreaker, say your name and something about you that you can't tell just by virtue of looking at you, right? Tell me a fun fact about yourself that no one could ever guess. And one of the things that happens is people find other people in the class that they wouldn't have necessarily talked to or connected with because they have this shared fun fact, right? Something like that. And so then you can move from there into kind of setting up group projects and group activities that are going to be based on criteria that don't have to do with the social formation, on other sorts of things. Is this the kind of thing you were looking for?
Well, I guess my question is, when you move from the classroom to the research space, or to a department in which you don't have this interpersonal opportunity to learn something about someone outside of their social formation, and maybe the only reason you talk about someone is their social formation, how do you avoid this? I think about a lot of research on maybe anti-colonial work, where it seems like the colonized become reduced to only being able to operate in their role as the colonized, because that is the condition in which they are researched. So how do we avoid this?
I see.
Yeah.
So here's the situation where, the black woman can only do social philosophy and not do metaphysics? That problem?
Or just when we study the black woman, we only study her as her operation, as her in the social formation of black women. And so thus we cannot comprehend her outside of it.
I think I'm just not getting this phenomenon. I just don't, how is it that I can only think of someone in her social formation and only talk about people in their social formation. I just don't, I guess I'm just not getting it.
In your lecture, you seem to a lot of times go outside of what you were talking about to give concrete examples as a way of personalizing these people outside of just their role as a submissive social formation or the dominated. Yet I feel like there's a lot of research where this isn't done. And so in classroom settings, you see people only be able to formulate their perspectives on these people through their social formations.
I see. Well, maybe because I think that there's a difference. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is analyze the dominant techne and the dominant system. But oh my God, I'm so aware that there are all of these, my family is a system, right? And my family is a mess, right? And it's just got disability and race and class and all of this stuff that's just like, so it's, I think maybe philosophers need to get out a bit more and get some life experience, I think. That would be and thinking about people, if you only spend your time in philosophy departments, I mean, I know Michigan is different, with a bunch of cis white men who are thinking about things from their experience, then kill me now, right? Because they don't know shit. They don't know anything, right? And then you come in from having just spent the evening in the psych ward with your daughter, and they're talking about stuff, and you're going, I'm sorry, that's not life. That's not the world. And so you need to get out in the world. But see, part of them, they're just not very socially skilled. And so if they go out in the world, and I'm all about neurodiversity, but if they go out in the world, they're not even going to see it if they go out in the world because they can't see it, right? So diversify, diversify, diversify.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for this amazing talk. I was thinking about President Ono's quote at the beginning where he says that things are not getting worse, they're getting uncovered. I was wondering, what are some of the ways that we can uncover the underlying structure or cultural logic that's governing these oppressive dynamics? And also, who is doing the uncovering, and how does their own biases and their own experiences lead to maybe ways we can identify these groups that in ways, because I think there's lots of ways that oppression can be very subversive and subtle, and a lot of them of which we have not yet uncovered. And I think who's doing the uncovering also speaks volumes to who has power, like who's allowed to construct these social systems or model them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we all have opportunities to, first, uncovering it within yourself, right? So, like, talking about menstrual shame, right? I gave a talk in the Netherlands where I spent quite a bit of time talking about my work in Kenya, and I had women come, say, I've never heard anyone in a public lecture say the word menstruation, right? I'm saying, get used to it, right? This is, there's just, look, these are our lives and our bodies, and there's this, and menstrual shame is pretty global, right? I've talked to a lot of people in a lot of places working on this. It's pretty global, talking about it. And so some of it is saying, oh, I never talk about that. Where's the unveil? There's a bit of unveiling that needs to happen around women's bodies in particular. I'm sorry, I should say women's bodies, also female bodies, also bodies that menstruate. I don't mean to suggest that all women menstruate. I don't mean to suggest that all women can get pregnant. I apologize for that. But it's my shorthand, and I should change more quickly, but I'm slow. Okay, so the menstruating bodies, talking about menstruation is okay, and how to cope with it and how to deal with it. It doesn't have to be shameful. So little things like that. It's a little thing for me to say the word menstruation standing on the platform of Rackham Auditorium, right, and talking about shame. It's a small thing, but it can cascade. It can make a difference. So we all have the power, and this is when I was talking about how, the cultural, the hope that comes And this is, the fluidity of culture is a reason to help because meanings are not controlled by the state or the law or the economy yet. I mean, they are trying to make us not talk about certain things, not say gay, things like that. But before we get thrown into prison by saying menstruation or gay or whatever like that, say the words, right? Use the language. Sort of find it in yourself so that you can speak with others about it. Because, again, going back to the Combahee River Collective, what they say is, this is also in Iris Young. I'm sorry, I'm getting on a roll here. I've talked too long and too much. But, you know, Iris Young has this beautiful stuff where she talks about this desiring negation. And you start with a desiring negation. It's like, I'm not doing this shit anymore, right? Get me out of here. This is like not okay. But then you might think, well, but maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just incompetent. Maybe I'm just no good at this. And you internalize all of that shame. And so you go find someone else who's similarly situated and you say, hey, have you ever noticed this? And they go, no, that's just happening to you because you're an asshole. And you go, okay, got it. Anyway, and then you try somebody else until finally someone says, oh yeah, no, I have that all the time. And so that is the beginning of the unveiling. That is the beginning where you find someone and you can suddenly see that the problem is not in you, the problem is out there. And then with that community, you build that community, and with that community, you can look around and start to notice things and explain things and do a paradigm shift. And then that's the moment of unveiling, when you have a collective way that is reasonably justified by ordinary epistemic norms. No, sorry, don't want to go too far into that, but you have a new paradigm that works better and that draws people into it. And all of us can do that. And you'll be biased, but then you need to talk to people who are in a slightly different social position, who maybe don't see it quite like you do because they're of a different class or whatever like that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very empowering message that change can happen at the individual level. Yeah, thank you.
But then it has to network and it has to build into a movement, right? It can't just, individual change is not enough. Just being able to talk about your own menstrual period is not enough, except you know that, but.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for a very good talk. I agree with you that when it comes to a lot of things like, for example, crimmigration, it's not explanatorily useful to refer to it as part of the logic of capital, even if it's true in some sense. You could also refer to it as the logic of the biosphere, but thinking about it just as occurring within the biosphere doesn't help us explain it. But there seem to be other cases where our understanding of the issue actually is aided by thinking of it as relating to various capitalist things. So, for example, factory farming, where it's being done specifically to enrich various fairly large corporations, and when U.S. foreign policy planners take actions largely as the result of disproportionately business interests. So I'd be curious, what would you make of whether, the idea of thinking about things in terms of the logic of capital is useful in those cases where it seems to more accurately explain part of what's going on?
Oh, the logic of capital is almost always explaining part of what's going on. I think in crimmigration it does, and it's always part of the story, right? I'm just saying that these dynamics are multiple and complex, and they interact in ways where, the logic of Christian heteronormativity can swamp capital, as that logic can overcome some of the other in certain practices, communities, and such like that. So I'm just trying to make the claim that, because I do think the logic of capitalism is baked in to pretty much everything. But it's about what are the other bits that are baked in, right, that aren't capital. And factory farming, I think this issue between the sort of the animal and the human, the non-human animal and the human animal, there's a lot there that is also connected to eugenics, and it's also connected to disability studies, and it's also connected, there's this whole logic of what it is to be human that I think is implicated there. So I don't think that factory farming is just about capital.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just want to just remind you quickly about the symposium tomorrow. 10 starts at 10 on the 4th floor, and I hope you can show up for that. Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you. It was a tremendous honor. Great questions. Great questions. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you for caring about these issues. It really is important. Thanks for bringing me here and making. Oh, Shelley. Where's Shelley?
Shelley here?
Yes, Shelley. No, not here. Back here. Are you there? I can't see you. Thanks also to our interpreter. It really is wonderful that the University of Michigan has made it possible to have an interpreter for this. So thank you.